The transport ship arrived at Manila Bay on February 15, 1945, under cover of darkness. Among the liberated prisoners from Santo Tomas internment camp were 17 Japanese civilian women who had been captured during the early months of American occupation. Most were nurses, teachers, or translators who had remained in the Philippines when evacuation orders came in 1942. Military records from the time described their transfer to a temporary detention facility near the docks as routine processing. What the documents failed to mention was the mood among Allied troops that night. 3 years of brutal occupation had left deep scars. Stories of atrocities committed against Filipino civilians and Allied prisoners circulated freely among the ranks. The arrival of Japanese captives, regardless of their civilian status, stirred emotions that military discipline struggled to contain. Canadian Army nurse Claire Robinson had arrived in Manila just 2 weeks earlier as part of the Medical Relief Corps. Her unit had established a field hospital in a former university building, treating both liberated Allied prisoners and wounded soldiers from ongoing operations. The 28-year-old from Ontario had seen enough suffering in Italy and France to understand that war twisted decent people into shapes they barely recognized. The detention facility sat 3 blocks from the harbor, a converted warehouse surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Inside, the 17 Japanese women waited in a single room, uncertain of their fate. Among them was Aiko Tanaka, a 31-year-old nurse who had worked at Philippine General Hospital before the war. She spoke fluent English and often served as translator for her fellow detainees. According to a report filed by the facility's commanding officer, Captain James Morton, the situation remained stable through the first week. The women received standard prisoner rations and medical attention when requested. However, tensions began escalating as news arrived of continued fighting in northern Luzon and discoveries of mass graves throughout the archipelago. On February 22nd, a group of Australian soldiers visited the facility during their shore leave. Witness statements collected later suggested they had been drinking heavily at nearby establishments. The guards on duty that night included several men who had served in Papua New Guinea, where they had witnessed firsthand the treatment of Allied prisoners by Japanese forces. Private William Chen, a Filipino-American soldier from California, filed an incident report 3 days later. He described hearing raised voices and what sounded like furniture being overturned inside the detention area around 2300 hours. When he investigated, he found several off-duty soldiers attempting to force their way into the women's quarters. The guards, rather than intervening, appeared to be facilitating the intrusion. Claire Robinson learned of the situation through unofficial channels. Lieutenant Sarah Mackenzie, another Canadian nurse, had heard rumors from orderlies who transported supplies to the detention facility. The stories were fragmented and contradictory, but they painted a disturbing picture of systematic harassment that military authorities seemed unwilling or unable to address. The Medical Corps operated under different command structures than regular infantry units. This administrative separation, designed to maintain the neutrality of medical personnel, also provided certain privileges and responsibilities that extended beyond traditional military hierarchies. Robinson understood that her oath as a medical professional superseded other considerations, including national loyalties or desires for retribution. On February 25th, Robinson submitted a formal request to examine the female detainees for signs of illness or injury. The request cited Geneva Convention protocols regarding medical care for prisoners of war, though the legal status of civilian internees remained deliberately ambiguous in official documentation. Captain Morton approved the visit, possibly viewing it as a way to demonstrate proper treatment of prisoners to higher authorities. Robinson arrived at the facility accompanied by 2 medical orderlies and a translator. What she found contradicted the sanitized reports in official files. Several of the women showed signs of sleep deprivation and acute stress. More concerning were the bruises and defensive wounds that suggested physical altercation. When questioned through the translator, the women initially remained silent, but Aiko eventually spoke directly to Robinson in English. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it revealed a pattern of intimidation that had escalated over several nights. Groups of soldiers, often intoxicated, would arrive after official inspection hours. They would demand that the women perform various tasks or submit to questioning that bore no relation to legitimate intelligence gathering. The guards not only failed to intervene, but sometimes participated actively in these unauthorized visits. Robinson's report to her commanding officer, Colonel David Shaw, documented her medical findings without explicitly describing their implications. However, the language she used was carefully chosen to convey the urgency of the situation, while avoiding accusations that might trigger a broader investigation. She recommended immediate transfer of the detainees to a more secure facility, where medical monitoring could continue without interruption. The response came 48 hours later in the form of new orders. Rather than transferring the prisoners, military authorities assigned additional medical personnel to monitor their condition on site. Robinson found herself scheduled for daily visits to the detention facility, ostensibly to provide routine medical care, but effectively serving as a witness to whatever might occur during evening hours. Her presence initially deterred the most egregious behavior, but it also created new tensions among the guards and off-duty personnel who had grown accustomed to unsupervised access to the facility. Several soldiers complained to their officers about what they characterized as unnecessary coddling of enemy prisoners. These complaints were documented in disciplinary files, though no formal charges were ever filed. The situation reached a critical point on March 3rd, when Robinson arrived for her scheduled visit to find the facility in chaos. A fight had broken out between guards and a group of sailors from a recently arrived transport ship. The sailors, apparently unaware of the new protocols, had attempted to gain entry to the women's quarters, but were confronted by Private Chen and two other guards who had begun taking their protective duties seriously. The incident report filed by Captain Morton described the altercation as a misunderstanding about facility access procedures. However, medical records from the field hospital show that 3 men were treated for injuries consistent with a prolonged physical confrontation. More significantly, the report made no mention of what had prompted the sailors' visit or why tensions had escalated so rapidly. Robinson realized that her intermittent presence was insufficient to ensure the women's safety. The facility's location near the docks meant that it attracted attention from various military units rotating through Manila. Each new group brought its own perspectives on how Japanese prisoners should be treated, and not all of those perspectives aligned with official protocols or international law. She began volunteering for additional shifts, often arriving earlier than scheduled and remaining later than required. This pattern drew notice from other medical personnel, who questioned whether such dedication to prisoner welfare was appropriate or professionally necessary. Some colleagues expressed concern that Robinson's actions might be misinterpreted by military authorities or compromise her standing within the medical corps. The criticism intensified when Robinson requested permission to establish a permanent medical station within the detention facility itself. Her proposal, submitted on March 8th, argued that continuous medical supervision was necessary due to the poor physical condition of several detainees and the ongoing risk of disease transmission. The request was technically within her authority as a medical officer, but it represented an unprecedented expansion of medical involvement in prisoner operations. Colonel Shaw initially rejected the proposal, citing resource constraints and questioning whether such intensive medical care was warranted for enemy prisoners. However, Robinson persisted, submitting additional documentation that emphasized the potential public health implications if diseases were allowed to spread unchecked among any prisoner population. She also noted that several of the Japanese women possessed medical training that could prove valuable if they could be properly integrated into relief efforts. The second argument proved persuasive, though not for reasons Robinson had anticipated. Military authorities were beginning to recognize that the transition from occupation to reconstruction would require cooperation from educated Japanese civilians, particularly those with technical skills or knowledge of local conditions. The women in detention represented a potential resource rather than simply a security burden, but only if they could be maintained in reasonable physical and mental condition. On March 12th, Robinson was granted permission to establish what was officially designated as a medical observation unit within the detention facility. The arrangement allowed her to maintain a presence during critical evening hours when unauthorized visits had previously occurred. More importantly, it provided a legitimate framework for protecting the women without explicitly acknowledging that such protection had been necessary. The new arrangement worked, but at considerable personal cost to Robinson and the small team of medical personnel who supported her efforts. They found themselves working extended shifts in a facility that lacked adequate heating, lighting, and sanitation. The psychological pressure of constant vigilance, combined with hostility from some military personnel who viewed their actions as misplaced sympathy for the enemy, created stress that manifested in various ways. Robinson's personal letters, discovered years later in her family's papers, revealed the internal conflict she experienced. She had joined the medical corps to help Allied soldiers and civilians recover from the wounds of war. Instead, she found herself protecting former enemies from treatment that violated both medical ethics and her personal sense of human dignity. The irony was not lost on her that she was using her position as a liberator to shield those who had once been part of an occupying force. The arrangement continued through the end of March as military attention shifted to preparations for the invasion of Japan. The 17 Japanese women remained in detention, but their treatment stabilized under medical supervision. Several began assisting with care for other prisoners and refugees, using their nursing skills to support overwhelmed medical facilities. This gradual integration occurred without official acknowledgement or policy change, simply as a practical response to urgent needs. Aiko Tanaka proved particularly valuable as a translator and cultural intermediary. Her ability to communicate with Japanese prisoners of war and civilian refugees helped medical personnel provide more effective care while gathering intelligence about conditions in areas still under Japanese control. The information she provided was credited with improving treatment protocols for malnutrition and tropical diseases that affected many recently liberated prisoners. The irony of this development was not lost on anyone involved. Women who had been subjected to systematic harassment because of their nationality were now contributing to the welfare of those who had liberated them. The transformation occurred not through formal reconciliation or policy directives, but through the simple recognition that medical needs transcended political boundaries. However, not everyone accepted this evolution of circumstances. Several incidents occurred throughout April as new military units arrived in Manila and encountered the unusual arrangement at the detention facility. Each time, Robinson and her team had to explain and defend their presence, often to officers who questioned whether such protection was necessary or appropriate. The most serious challenge came on April 18th, when a group of recently arrived Marines attempted to override medical authority and remove several of the women for what they described as enhanced interrogation. The confrontation that followed involved not only medical personnel, but also military police and representatives from intelligence services who had developed their own interests in maintaining the current arrangement. Captain Morton's report on the incident carefully avoided describing the specific nature of the Marines' intentions or the reasons why multiple agencies intervened to prevent their actions. Instead, it focused on procedural issues and jurisdictional conflicts that could be resolved through clearer command structures. The language suggested that similar incidents might occur again unless policies were clarified and consistently enforced. Robinson understood that her ability to protect the women depended on maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical necessity rather than humanitarian concern. She began documenting every aspect of their care with meticulous detail, creating a paper trail that would justify continued medical supervision to any reviewing authority. The documentation also served another purpose, establishing a record of proper treatment that might prove valuable if questions arose about how Japanese prisoners had been handled during the transition period. The war ended abruptly in August, but the situation at the detention facility continued for several more weeks as authorities determined how to process civilian prisoners and coordinate repatriation. The sudden end of hostilities created new complications as soldiers who had been preparing for invasion found themselves managing peace instead. The shift in mindset required time, and not everyone adapted at the same pace. Robinson's final report on the Medical Observation Unit, filed in September 1945, summarized 6 months of continuous operations without mentioning the underlying tensions that had necessitated its creation. The document focused on health outcomes, resource utilization, and procedural recommendations for future prisoner operations. Between the lines, however, it told the story of a small group of medical professionals who had chosen to honor their ethical obligations despite significant personal and professional risks. The 17 Japanese women were eventually repatriated in October 1945. No formal recognition was given to the medical personnel who had supervised their care, nor was any official acknowledgement made of the circumstances that had required such supervision. The incident report files were archived with thousands of other documents from the Philippine operations, becoming part of a vast administrative record that few would ever examine. Aiko Tanaka returned to Japan, where she resumed her nursing career and eventually established a small clinic in Osaka. Her personal papers, donated to a university archive in 1982, included several letters written to Claire Robinson in the months following repatriation. The correspondence, conducted through Red Cross channels, expressed gratitude while carefully avoiding specific references to events in Manila. Robinson remained in military service until 1947, serving in various medical facilities across the Pacific before returning to civilian practice in Canada. Her personnel file contained numerous commendations for medical service, but no mention of her work at the detention facility. The administrative separation between medical and security operations meant that her contributions existed in parallel records that were rarely cross-referenced. The Medical Observation Unit established at the Manila Detention Facility became a model for similar operations in other locations, where military authorities recognized the value of continuous medical supervision for prisoner populations. However, the underlying reasons for its creation were never formally acknowledged or addressed through policy changes. Instead, it remained an ad hoc solution to problems that official sources preferred not to discuss in detail. Private William Chen, the Filipino-American soldier who had filed the original incident report, was awarded a Bronze Star for his service in the Philippines. The citation mentioned his dedication to duty and protection of civilian populations, but provided no specifics about the circumstances that had led to the recognition. Chen later became a police officer in Los Angeles, where he occasionally spoke to community groups about his military service while avoiding discussion of particular incidents. The detention facility itself was demolished in 1946 as part of Manila's post-war reconstruction. The site was eventually developed into a commercial district, and today no physical evidence remains of the temporary structures that once housed prisoners and their reluctant guardians. The transformation of the location mirrors the broader pattern of how difficult wartime situations were allowed to fade from official memory rather than being examined for lessons they might provide. Colonel Shaw, Robinson's commanding officer, advanced to general rank in the post-war military, but never publicly discussed the administrative challenges he had faced in balancing security requirements with medical ethics. His memoirs, published in the 1970s, focused on strategic operations and organizational achievements, while omitting references to smaller-scale incidents that had required delicate handling. The broader context of Japanese civilian detention in the Philippines received limited historical attention in subsequent decades. Most accounts focused on the liberation of Allied prisoners and the restoration of Filipino sovereignty, rather than the complex decisions required to manage former occupiers who remained in Allied custody. This selective emphasis reflected both the immediate priorities of post-war reconstruction and the natural tendency to emphasize positive outcomes over problematic details. Medical records from the period show that prisoner mortality rates in facilities with continuous medical supervision were significantly lower than in those without such care. However, the correlation was never formally studied or incorporated into official policies for future operations. The benefits of medical presence were attributed to better disease control and improved sanitation rather than the protection it provided against non-medical threats. Robinson's approach to prisoner care influenced a generation of military medical personnel who served under her supervision in the Philippines. Several of these individuals later established their own protocols for medical ethics in combat situations, though they rarely cited the Manila detention facility as a specific example. Instead, they spoke in general terms about the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of political considerations. The Geneva Conventions, revised in 1949, incorporated new provisions for medical care of prisoners that reflected lessons learned during World War II. While no direct connection can be established between events in Manila and the revised protocols, the timing suggests that experiences like Robinson's contributed to a broader recognition of the need for clearer guidelines regarding medical personnel's responsibilities toward all persons in custody. Academic interest in the incident remained limited until the 1990s, when researchers examining women's roles in World War II began uncovering documentation about female prisoners and their treatment. However, most of this research focused on Allied women held by Axis powers rather than the reverse situation. The story of Japanese women protected by Allied medical personnel represented an unusual case that didn't fit easily into established narrative frameworks. Eiko Tanaka's papers, when they finally became available to researchers, provided crucial insights into the perspective of those who had been detained. Her careful documentation of daily life in custody revealed both the routine indignities of imprisonment and the significance of small acts of human kindness. Her letters to Robinson suggested that the medical officer's presence had meant far more than just physical protection. The correspondence between the two women, conducted sporadically over several decades, demonstrated how wartime relationships could evolve beyond the circumstances that created them. Robinson's letters, copies of which were preserved in Tanaka's archive, showed a medical professional grappling with the long-term implications of decisions made under extreme pressure. Both women seemed to understand that they had participated in something historically significant, though neither attempted to claim recognition for their actions. Modern military medical ethics training includes case studies that bear remarkable similarity to the situation Robinson faced in Manila, though the historical connection is not always made explicit. Medical officers learn about the tension between following orders and maintaining professional standards, the importance of documentation in protecting both patients and providers, and the need to prepare for situations where medical authority might be the only protection available to vulnerable populations. The Manila detention facility case demonstrates how individual decisions by medical personnel could influence the treatment of prisoners even when official policies remained unchanged. Robinson's choice to expand medical involvement in prisoner operations created a framework that others could follow without requiring formal acknowledgement of the problems it was designed to address. This indirect approach proved more sustainable than confronting military authorities directly about prisoner mistreatment. The 17 Japanese women who were detained in Manila represented only a small fraction of the civilian prisoners processed by Allied forces in the Pacific. However, their experience illustrates broader patterns of how military organizations struggled to balance security concerns with humanitarian obligations during the transition from combat to occupation. The solutions that emerged were often improvised and dependent on the initiative of individual officers rather than systematic policy development. Robinson's personnel file, when finally declassified in the 1990s, revealed that her superiors had been aware of the tensions at the detention facility and had deliberately chosen to address them through expanded medical oversight rather than disciplinary action. This approach allowed military authorities to solve immediate problems while avoiding precedents that might complicate future operations. The strategy proved effective in the short term, but contributed to a pattern of addressing symptoms rather than underlying causes. The Medical Observation Unit's success in preventing serious incidents while maintaining operational security made it an attractive model for other situations where prisoner populations might be vulnerable to unofficial retaliation. However, the resource requirements and personnel commitments involved made it difficult to implement widely. Most facilities continued to rely on standard guard procedures, supplemented by periodic inspections rather than continuous medical presence. Training materials developed by the Military Medical Corps in the post-war period included references to the importance of monitoring prisoner health, but avoided specific discussion of threats that might require such monitoring. The guidance emphasized professional responsibilities and documentation requirements while leaving implementation details to individual medical officers' judgment. This approach preserved flexibility while acknowledging that standard procedures might prove insufficient in certain circumstances. The gradual integration of Japanese medical personnel into relief operations represented an early example of how former enemies could become valuable allies during post-conflict reconstruction. However, this transformation required careful management to avoid both security risks and resentment among Allied personnel who had suffered under Japanese occupation. Medical settings provided a neutral environment where such cooperation could develop naturally based on shared professional commitments. Robinson's experience in Manila influenced her subsequent career in ways that extended far beyond military service. When she returned to civilian practice, she specialized in treating refugees and displaced persons, populations that often faced similar vulnerabilities to those she had encountered among detained Japanese women. Her approach emphasized building trust through consistent care and advocacy, rather than attempting to address systemic problems through confrontation. The documentation practices Robinson developed at the detention facility became standard procedure for military medical operations involving vulnerable populations. The emphasis on detailed record-keeping served multiple purposes, justifying resource allocation, protecting medical personnel from criticism, and creating evidence that could support policy changes if political conditions became more favorable. These practices proved particularly valuable during the Korean War, when similar situations arose involving civilian prisoners. Modern conflict resolution theory recognizes the importance of protecting former adversaries during transition periods as a factor in long-term stability and reconciliation. The Manila Detention Facility case provides historical evidence for this principle, showing how relatively small investments in humanitarian treatment could prevent cycles of retaliation that might complicate post-conflict relationships. However, this lesson was not formally incorporated into military doctrine until much later. The relationship between Aiko Tanaka and Claire Robinson evolved over the decades into a friendship that transcended the circumstances of their initial meeting. Their correspondence reveals two professionals who recognized that they had shared an experience that highlighted both the worst and best aspects of human behavior under extreme stress. Neither woman sought publicity for her role, but both understood that their actions had mattered in ways that extended beyond immediate circumstances. Private Chen's decision to file an incident report represented a crucial moment when individual conscience overcame institutional pressure to remain silent about prisoner mistreatment. His action provided the documentation that allowed medical authorities to intervene effectively while maintaining the appearance of routine medical care. The courage required for this decision was never formally recognized, but it demonstrates how positive outcomes often depend on individuals willing to accept personal risks to uphold professional standards. The demolition of the Manila Detention Facility eliminated physical evidence of the events that occurred there, but the administrative records scattered across various archives preserve the essential details. These documents, when assembled and analyzed, reveal patterns of decision-making that reflect both the immediate pressures of military occupation and the longer-term implications of how former enemies are treated during transition periods. The story of the Manila Detention Facility illustrates how military medical personnel can serve as crucial protection for vulnerable populations, even when official policies provide inadequate guidance. Robinson's approach demonstrated that medical authority, properly exercised, could create safe spaces within larger systems that might otherwise permit abuse. This precedent proved influential in subsequent conflicts, though the connection is not always explicitly acknowledged. The broader implications of this case extend beyond military operations to any situation where institutional power creates vulnerabilities that formal oversight mechanisms cannot address effectively. The medical model of continuous presence and detailed documentation provides an alternative to both direct confrontation and passive acceptance of unacceptable conditions. This approach requires individual courage and professional commitment, but can achieve results that more dramatic interventions might not. Robinson's final report on the Medical Observation Unit concluded with recommendations that were never officially implemented, but influenced informal practices for decades afterward. Her emphasis on the connection between medical ethics and operational effectiveness resonated with military leaders who recognized that prisoner mistreatment could create both immediate problems and long-term complications for occupation forces. The arguments she developed proved more persuasive than humanitarian appeals alone. The 17 Japanese women who were protected by the Medical Observation Unit returned to their homeland, carrying experiences that shaped their understanding of both American military culture and the possibilities for reconciliation between former enemies. Several became advocates for international cooperation and peaceful resolution of conflicts. Though their wartime experiences were rarely discussed publicly, their influence operated through personal networks and professional relationships rather than formal positions or public statements. The Manila Detention Facility case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about prisoner treatment, medical ethics in conflict zones, and the responsibilities of military personnel when official policies prove inadequate to address humanitarian concerns. The solutions developed by Robinson and her team provide practical examples of how individual professionals can uphold ethical standards while working within institutional constraints. These examples continue to influence training programs and policy development in military medical services around the world. The documentation preserved from the Manila Detention Facility represents one of the few detailed records of how military medical personnel addressed the complex challenges of protecting vulnerable prisoners during the chaotic final months of World War II. These records provide insights into both the immediate decisions required in specific situations and the broader patterns of institutional adaptation when standard procedures prove insufficient. The lessons they contain remain applicable to contemporary conflicts where similar challenges arise. The legacy of Claire Robinson's service in the Philippines extends far beyond the specific individuals she protected or the policies she influenced. Her example demonstrates how medical professionals can maintain ethical standards under extreme pressure while achieving practical results that benefit both immediate patients and broader institutional interests. The balance she achieved between professional obligation and political reality provides a model for others facing similar challenges in different contexts. The years following the war brought scattered revelations that filled gaps in the official record. In 1953, a former intelligence officer published memoirs that briefly mentioned classified operations involving Japanese civilian prisoners in Manila. The reference was vague, but it confirmed that military authorities had been aware of potential problems with prisoner treatment and had taken deliberate steps to prevent incidents that might complicate post-war relations with Japan. Captain Morton's personnel file, declassified decades later, revealed that he had received specific instructions to cooperate with medical personnel regarding prisoner welfare, though the reasons for these instructions were never explicitly stated. His efficient handling of what could have become a serious diplomatic incident contributed to his post-war promotion to major, though the connection was never formally acknowledged. The Medical Corps' adoption of Robinson's documentation methods proved prescient when similar situations arose during the Korean War. Military medical personnel found themselves again responsible for protecting vulnerable prisoners, but this time they had established procedures and precedents to guide their actions. The lessons learned in Manila influenced how medical units approached prisoner care throughout the 1950s and 60s. Aiko Tanaka's clinic in Osaka became a model for community health care in post-war Japan. Her approach emphasized building trust with patients through consistent care and advocacy, principles she had learned during her own period of vulnerability. She never publicly discussed her detention in Manila, but colleagues noted her particular sensitivity to patients who had experienced trauma or displacement. Robinson's final years were spent training military medical personnel at a teaching hospital in Toronto. Her lectures on medical ethics included case studies that bore strong resemblance to her experiences in the Philippines, though she never explicitly connected them to her own service. Students remembered her emphasis on the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of external pressures or popular opinion. The correspondence between Robinson and Tanaka ended in 1978 when Robinson died of natural causes. Tanaka continued her medical practice for another decade. Retiring in 1988, She donated her papers to Osaka University with instructions that they remain sealed until the year 2000, by which time she believed historical perspective would allow proper evaluation of the events they documented. When Tanaka's archive finally became available to researchers, it revealed the extent to which the Manila detention facility had influenced both women's subsequent careers and personal philosophies. Their letters showed how a brief wartime encounter had created lasting bonds based on shared recognition of human dignity under extreme circumstances. The professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship that transcended national boundaries and historical grievances. Modern military medical training includes scenarios based on the Manila detention facility case, though the historical connection is not always made explicit. Medical officers learn about balancing professional obligations with institutional loyalties, the importance of documentation in protecting both patients and providers, and the need to prepare for situations where medical authority might provide the only available protection for vulnerable populations. The 17 Japanese women who were detained in Manila represented thousands of civilians who found themselves in similar situations throughout the Pacific War. Most of their stories were never documented with the detail that Robinson's records provided. The Manila case remains significant not because it was unique, but because it was unusually well documented and demonstrated how individual initiative could influence outcomes even when official policies remained unchanged. Private Chen's incident report, filed on February 25, 1945, remained buried in administrative files until researchers discovered it in the 1990s. The document provided crucial evidence of the conditions that had necessitated medical intervention, validating Robinson's decision to expand medical involvement in prisoner operations. Chen's courage in documenting problems he witnessed proved as important as the medical personnel's efforts to address them. The Manila detention facility operated for only 8 months, but its influence extended far beyond that brief period. The precedent it established for medical protection of vulnerable prisoners influenced military doctrine for decades afterward. The documentation it generated provided evidence for the effectiveness of humanitarian approaches to prisoner management, supporting arguments for policy changes that might not otherwise have been adopted. Colonel Shaw's endorsement of Robinson's Medical Observation Unit demonstrated how military leaders could address humanitarian concerns while maintaining operational effectiveness. His decision to support expanded medical involvement in prisoner operations required considerable professional courage, as it meant accepting responsibility for unconventional procedures that might later be criticized. His judgment proved correct, but the personal risks involved should not be understated. The gradual declassification of documents related to the Manila detention facility has allowed historians to piece together a complete picture of events that were deliberately obscured in contemporary records. The full story reveals how individual decisions by military medical personnel could influence institutional practices even when formal policies remained unchanged. These insights continue to inform discussions about medical ethics in conflict situations. The destruction of the physical facility in 1946 eliminated tangible evidence of the events that occurred there, but the human relationships formed during those 8 months proved more durable than concrete and steel. The bonds between former enemies and their protectors demonstrated possibilities for reconciliation that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. These relationships provided foundations for broader cooperation between former adversaries in subsequent decades. Robinson's approach to prisoner protection through medical oversight became a standard technique used in various conflicts throughout the Cold War period. The method proved particularly effective because it addressed humanitarian concerns while maintaining operational security and avoiding direct challenges to military authority. This balance made it sustainable in ways that more confrontational approaches might not have been. The Manila case illustrates how positive outcomes in difficult situations often result from the convergence of individual courage, institutional flexibility, and historical circumstances that create opportunities for constructive action. None of these factors alone would have been sufficient to protect the 17 Japanese women, but their combination created possibilities that were successfully exploited by dedicated professionals. The final documentation from the Manila detention facility was archived in 1946, with thousands of other administrative records from Pacific operations. These files remained largely unexamined until the 1990s, when changing political circumstances and scholarly interest in women's wartime experiences brought new attention to previously ignored aspects of military history. The discovery of Robinson's detailed records provided insights that had been unavailable to earlier historians. Today, the site where the Manila detention facility once stood hosts a commercial district bustling with international businesses. The transformation reflects the broader evolution of Philippine-American-Japanese relations, from wartime hostility through post-war reconstruction to contemporary cooperation. The human foundations for this positive evolution were laid by individuals like Robinson, Chen, and Morton, who chose to uphold professional standards despite significant personal and institutional pressures. The story of the Manila detention facility ends not with dramatic resolution, but with quiet recognition of how small acts of professional courage could influence broader historical patterns. 17 Japanese women returned safely to their homeland because medical personnel chose to expand their protective responsibilities beyond traditional boundaries. This outcome required no changes in official policy, only the willingness of individual professionals to interpret their existing authorities in ways that prioritized human dignity over convenience or popular prejudice. The precedent established in Manila influenced military medical practices for decades afterward, though the connection was rarely acknowledged explicitly. The techniques Robinson developed for protecting vulnerable prisoners through expanded medical oversight became standard procedures used in various conflicts throughout the Cold War period and beyond. Her innovations demonstrated how medical authority could serve humanitarian purposes while maintaining operational effectiveness and institutional credibility. The letters exchanged between Robinson and Tanaka in the years following the war provide evidence of how professional relationships formed under extreme circumstances could evolve into lasting personal connections that transcended national boundaries and historical grievances. Their correspondence shows two women who understood that they had participated in something historically significant, though neither sought public recognition for her role. The Manila detention facility case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about prisoner treatment, medical ethics in conflict zones, and the responsibilities of military personnel when official policies prove inadequate to address humanitarian concerns. The solutions developed by Robinson and her team provide practical examples of how individual professionals can uphold ethical standards while working within institutional constraints, examples that continue to influence training programs and policy development around the world. Years after the war ended, documents scattered across various archives preserved the essential details of events at the Manila detention facility. When assembled and analyzed, these records reveal patterns of decision-making that reflect both immediate operational pressures and longer-term implications of how former enemies are treated during transition periods. The lessons they contain remain applicable to contemporary situations where similar challenges arise. The 17 Japanese women who were protected by the Medical Observation Unit carried their experiences back to Japan, where several became advocates for international cooperation and peaceful resolution of conflicts. Their influence operated through personal networks and professional relationships rather than public statements, contributing to broader patterns of reconciliation between former enemies. The human connections formed during their detention proved more durable than the physical structures that once confined them. Until today, military medical personnel study scenarios based on the Manila detention facility case, learning about the balance between professional obligation and institutional loyalty that Robinson achieved under extreme pressure. Her example demonstrates how medical professionals can maintain ethical standards while achieving practical results that benefit both immediate patients and broader institutional interests. The lessons from Manila continue to guide military medical personnel facing similar challenges in contemporary conflicts around the world.